All right. So we're with Nolte Ferguson, and you are with Sucafina Specialty Coffees, and you've been on the trading side of coffee, focusing on supply chains in East Africa especially, right, throughout your career. And as a senior trader with Specialty Coffee, or Sucafina, you gave a lecture here at SCA on innovation and risk and how it relates to roasters in particular. I know you were focused on packaging and other facets of that. So first, welcome to
Thank you.
This interview. I'm really glad to have you. And I think the first thing to talk about is, another thing that you do is you're a chair. You're a chair of the Specialty Coffee's Sustainability Advisory Council, right?
I was, for many years. So I participated on the Sustainability Council for I want to say 8 years, and I was the chair for the last 2 of those.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay. Yeah. So you've got a lot of deep knowledge on these things, and I'm really excited to kind of dig in here. So, I mean, the first thing is when we get to a place, like when you get to a place in your career right now where you're talking about risk and innovation, and you're relating these ideas to roasters. And even before we started recording, we were talking about this, that there's a lot of mechanisms behind the scenes that contribute to the reality that roasters have to deal with day in and day out, especially these days with supply chains. How do you approach that topic, first off, given your knowledge of the industry and then your knowledge of roasters?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I started in the industry as a barista, and it has been a long journey to, come into the green side of coffee, and then I'm spending as much time at origin and in East Africa learning about supply chains. I feel like I would never claim to know very much, because every time you think you know something, you learn something totally new.
Right.
And so for me, I'm always interested in the different perspectives and the different people and where they're operating at with coffee. But then it's interesting because in business, and especially as a business owner or somebody who's in leadership for an organization, you're constantly having to make decisions, but without necessarily having perfect information. And so you're constantly looking for different points of data. And so I think I come to price risk management from a place where I know what it's like to wonder about the market and what it means and what's going on. And the world of finance is not an easy world to enter and to understand, because there's a lot of, jargon. There's a lot of financial jargon surrounding it. And then it also can be just intimidating because things happen in the market that you can't predict. And, no matter how long you've been trading coffee or how closely you monitor the market moves and the market price, you're not really predicting things, you're more reacting to things. So you're trying to figure out, why did these things happen, and then how can I adapt?
Right, and how can I feel a little bit more confident the next time something comes around, because it's cyclical, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to feel out of control, and maybe that's a normal feeling for somebody who's a new roaster, and they feel like, well, this is just the ropes. I'm learning the ropes.
Yeah.
But then 10 years in, it feels like if you don't have an understanding at that point, you're still feeling like, I'm still learning the ropes. And It's still confusing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, I was just talking to a roaster about this, is when you're talking about price risk and risk management, from the roaster perspective, and especially the specialty roaster perspective, he was saying how he went into roasting to roast. And, he was thinking, I am going to start a coffee roaster, I'm going to roast coffee, and wasn't expecting to have to learn all these things about the financial markets and the price of coffee and the supply chain, and figuring out that, these things related, even sustainability, he was using as an example, is, I thought I was going to start roasting coffee. I didn't know I was going to learn all these things about what is needed at origin amongst farmers, and, what's driving price in the market and how the market relates to roasted and green coffee. It was just like a whole new world that, he was sort of like, I didn't know I was going to have to do all this, but it's amazing. And so to answer your first question, when I enter these conversations with specialty roasters, I feel like it's important to enter them and make it kind of a safe space and no question is a stupid question. Just ask whatever you need to know, kind of thing.
That's interesting that you say in this fictitious roaster that you're talking about, who says this about what I needed to learn, and I didn't know it, but I had to. I'm interested in the had part of that, where, there's times where you feel like all I need to do are these things, and you could sort of stay in that bubble of simplicity. But where does it come into a roaster's purview to start to learn about those things? What motivates them, or what forces them to have to deal with those things?
I think definitely the way that buying green coffee affects your business. It can play out in a number of different ways. So for 4 or 5 years, the market price was really low, and maybe almost too low. I mean, definitely too low from, a cost of production standpoint. And as a roaster, you get used to that market environment, and you might start asking questions like, are farmers being paid enough? And start adapting your business model to pay farmers more. And then it's an interesting time in coffee, because right now, as you're buying green coffee, the prices have spiked and they're high right now. And so a lot of roasters are asking themselves the opposite of like, okay, now I'm looking at, what to do to make my business work. Do I need to raise prices? Do I need to raise prices for wholesale accounts? How do I manage the price risk that's coming at me in a high market environment? And then how do you reach back into the supply chain and still make sure that you have a farmer-centric supply chain, but in a way that's going to also make the pricing work for you? So it's a hard topic, but it's one we need to talk about, and it definitely becomes a reality to the roaster so quickly.
It's easy for us when we start a roastery to say, on the business side of things, I'm going to hire an accountant to deal with the finances, because like that example, all I want to do is roast. And you, as a barista yourself, former barista, or once a barista, always a barista, right? I guess.
Yeah. I have an espresso machine at home.
See, me too. I am still a barista. But it's a very relational group of people that get into coffee, typically, especially in specialty coffee. I think there's a lot of empathy that people naturally have. And so this trajectory of wanting to learn more about the mechanisms behind the scenes in order for your coffee business to actually do good, rather than just stay in business, I think that's interesting, that we want it to transcend just transactions. We want to learn more because we want to do more, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely. I think specialty coffee is unique in that. And you can't just hire an accountant to buy the coffee, because when you're a roaster and you're working with the physical product and you see how not every coffee is processed the same and not every coffee is equal and all these coffees are so different. And I think it's natural to have then a curiosity to the people and the process and the methods behind the coffee and where did it come from. Yeah. And then when you start to peel back those layers, I think there is a natural curiosity that happened. I know that happened for me, even as a barista. I fell in love with coffee, like so deeply in love with coffee. And all I could do was all I wanted was to know, where did this come from? Where did these beautiful products come from? And then you read more about the supply chain and some of the more enduring issues in our supply chain with poverty, clean water, a lot of the things that are realities for farmers and farmers are facing. I think it's a very natural thing to want to delve into the supply chain in a deeper way. Okay.
So your role in talking about these things is to, you've told me, put it into bite-sized chunks, understandable for people who this information will help, the roasters, the business owners. How do you do that? If you broke it down and said, okay, if you really want an understanding of these the price risk management ideas and finances behind what's going on in your roastery, what do you start with and why?
Well, today, it depends on the market environment, I think, but in today's market, because the C market is so high and then differentials are also high and then freight is also high. So I think a lot of small and mid-sized roasters are in a similar position, asking themselves, what do we do? Do we raise prices to the consumer, or, how do we manage our risk? Mm-hmm. And I think it's an interesting time where I've seen roasters be a little bit more flexible. So not necessarily sourcing from supply chains that aren't relationship driven, but actually being flexible in like which components they'll use in a blend, for example. So
Okay.
I've seen roasters substitute a China for a Guatemala, for example, because the pricing worked, but it still was a coffee that went all the way back to the farmer, and like you had like traceability, transparency in the supply chain, even an organic coffee, for example. I've also seen people working with Java instead of Sumatra. So Java is an island in Indonesia that produces coffee that is the same quality in the wet hauled processing, and it just doesn't have that Sumatra name. And so sometimes roasters, have trouble taking a second look at it. But it's actually a coffee where the differential price is cheaper. And it's because of a supply and demand. So Sumatra, if there's so much demand and right now the freight is also high, the market is high. And so it's a very high priced coffee, and a lot of people blend with it and a lot of people use it for single origin. So I've seen roasters be kind of innovating in being adaptable and flexible in which origins they'll use. I've seen Uganda substituted in for Colombia. And again, it's all, you can still maintain vertically integrated supply chains where you have visibility straight through to the farmer and can even know, that the farmers are being taken care of or, earning or appreciative of the trade. And so it's not like a commercial, like no name sort of style of trading, but you can look to other origins to manage your price risk on the green side, and you can do it in a way that is respectful to farmers and farmer relationships.
And that would be your value that you want to maintain while mitigating risk, because sometimes, like if I just thought without this conversation having happened about mitigating risk, I'm thinking I got to be in it for me. I got to make sure come hell or high water, we're just going to cut here, we're going to cut there, but this is a values-based decision framework that you're talking about.
I think for me it is, for us, for the roasters that I work with, especially in the specialty industry, it can definitely be very values-driven decisions that you make around, but I think the main message is you can be flexible, you can be adaptable, you can still maintain relationships with your origin partners. And then what we try to do at Sucafina is to be very vertically integrated and very efficient. So if more often than not, we're buying coffee from farms or farmers and selling it to roasters. That's a lot more of it's a more compressed supply chain. It's a more efficient supply chain than if, there's multiple trading companies in between the farmer and the roaster, for example. So, and it doesn't sound too complicated to buy from farmers, sell to roasters, but coffee doesn't get traded that way as often as you would think.
There's a lot more complexity there.
A lot more complexity, yeah. And so, for me, it's like put as few cupping labs as possible in between the farmer and the roaster. And I think you've got like a very efficient, compressed supply chain that is like as direct trade can possibly be. Okay,
that makes sense. So that is something, how does that manifest in how the roaster operates their business when they are operating from that like direct relationship that you're talking about, where there's fewer in-betweens, it's more direct. How does that help them mitigate risk? Do they just have more options at that point? Like they have an ability to just turn with greater, what's the word I'm looking for, just quicker?
I think knowing your supply chain so well in that sense, it helps you manage risk in that you can get information from your supply base more quickly. But it's in terms of managing risk on the roaster side, it's actually, you do put yourself at risk if you're locking in relationships so tightly, then you're reliant on that specific exact producer every single time. Does that make sense? And so, so that actually can be risky. So as a roaster, one of the things we say is that you should have multiple suppliers of coffee always, because, you know, if something happens to a country of origin or to one of your suppliers, you're going to need to still source coffee and procure coffee. And so it's important to diversify your supply base and to be flexible for sure. But with the compressed supply chains, that's just a way of, I guess, managing costs and price risk, because it is cheaper to buy coffee that way. And you don't have to pay the farmer less. It's just cutting out more of the middle section.
Okay. No.
We all want to trim down our midsection. So this is no different.
This is it. That's a good tip.
So I think there's two topics here, right? There's like relationship coffee and there's farmer focused coffee. And it is important to know what is happening at origin, what is happening with your supply chain and your farmers. Then there's also just a much more purely roaster-centric, roaster-driven kind of risk management. And that's where I'm saying that if you're managing your price risk in today's market, sometimes being flexible with who you're sourcing from and being flexible, like with rotating origins, can keep your blend quality higher, and it can also keep your prices for green coffee lower.
Okay, and the people that are concerned with relationship coffees mostly, especially now, we're talking about ideas like we've interviewed people in the past that talk about buying more coffee. Evermeister was on our program talking about buy more coffee from fewer roasters, basically, or fewer farmers, forgive me. The idea being that we need to really focus on the relationship and having risk management put in the language of have a default position or have a plan B, like farm.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're not dedicated to that particular farmer. So is there an appropriate level of risk that we should carry if we're going to be relationship focused?
It's a great question, and I love this topic so much. And it's thought-provoking. Even in this moment, it's thought-provoking. But relationship coffee is like the best model that we have, the direct trade model of coffee, where you're building coffee prices based on the farmer's income, cost of production, and then you're adding your costs and then selling it on. I think that is the most beautiful way to trade coffee. Mm-hmm. That is how maybe 4%, and that might even be a high guess, 4% of all the coffee in North America gets traded that way. And I think that's a pretty high estimate. And so one of the reasons that I joined Sucafina is because we trade the full spectrum. And so that is a true, people talk about whole harvest buying and stuff like that. That's incredibly hard to do as a small roaster. And there's also coffees that might come from a producer or a co-op that aren't specialty, and they also need a home. And so for a small specialty roaster to do a kind of like whole harvest of a single farmer is sometimes really difficult. You just don't roast enough volume to do it. And so I think where we come in on the trade side of things is to be able to support producers in that way and to be able to support farmers in that way and make the connections wherever possible. And so I think it's a fantastic idea if you can do it and if you have the volume to do it. But then, a farmer in Kenya, for example, you might be able to find some that produce 100 bags of coffee. So is your roaster big enough to absorb that? And then do you want to commit to that farmer in terms of quality and in terms of price year on year is a question for the roaster.
Yeah.
And it's like you have to value the relationship more than quality and price management at that point, if you're going to make that commitment, which I think is wonderful if you can make that commitment.
Sure.
But I think roasters also need to be realistic in what they can do.
Yeah, they're serving their market and they want to make sure that they stay in business because that's good for everybody if they're in business.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
It feels like also that the smaller you are as a roaster, it could be the more idealistic you are. But the larger ones have got there because they've incorporated a lot of corporate ideas and applications, and at that point that they're so large, in your experience, let me ask you, larger roasters, does the corporate necessities of being a large entity drown out the relationship that you say we need scale to make it work, but at scale, do you lose your desire to have relationship?
That's a good question as well. And then, the other thing is, So trading relationship coffee or direct trade coffee, it's an expensive way to trade coffee, and I'm a big supporter of the model. And I always say to people, like, buy and sell as much coffee as you can for like $25 for a 12-ounce bag. That's what I pay for my coffee.
Yeah.
And buy and sell as much of that as you can. But the consumer market for that style of coffee can be somewhat limited as well. And so as people start going for volume, they're going for a different type of consumer, a consumer that I would refer to as my mother. So my mom will not pay, $25
Sure.
a pound for a 12-ounce bag. She would, faint. If
It's not even a full pound.
It's not even a full pound. So, and I'm in Seattle on the West Coast, by the way. If anybody is
so it's
listening
a saturated
in the
market.
Midwest,
So you would think that Seattle moms would understand.
Well, my mom's in Wisconsin, though.
Oh, I see.
There's the ringer. But the point being is that I have interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of smallholder farmers in Africa. And the first thing that they always say to me is, please help us sell our coffee. The second thing that they say to me is, can you get a better price? And there is a large population of people who depend on coffee for their livelihoods and to make their life work. And I think that it takes sustainability in particular. It takes all kinds of models. I don't think there's one model that's going to make our trade and our industry sustainable. I think it's going to take a lot of people doing different things. And so there might be coffee farmers out there who are better off selling into higher volume markets. Or, I was talking to somebody who operates a really ethical sourcing operation in Colombia. And in this high market, he has farmers telling him, I can sell my coffee for more selling it into the commercial market than to you, because you do a lot of sorting, you do a lot of drying in specialty. So like the moisture percentage can be less, the sorting can be more, and then you lose all this volume as a producer.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, if I can dry my coffee and, I don't want to dry my coffee for 25 days and then sort it and then sell it to you at this like marginally higher price. I'd rather dry it for, less days, have more weight, do less sorting, and sell it into a commercial market at a similar price, like
Right.
a little bit less, but I'm selling more volume or more weight. And so, so I think it's a tricky one in this market environment, and we are in an unprecedented kind of market environment right now. So
Yeah, I was going to say there is a lot of like throwing around the term unprecedented, and it seems to be true, and not just in how the world is experiencing everything, in COVID and the related supply chain snafus and things like that. It's just unprecedented in what we've had to deal with in terms of what we've prioritized. Like we're trying to figure out what's important to us in the midst of trying to get through these times.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of self-reflection. And as you talk about risk management and about people that are saying, well, I'd rather sell to these people because I don't have to do all these things. It's I feel like important to remember that risk for somebody like a farmer is different than risk than for somebody like a roaster.
Yeah.
It may be more life or death. And I say maybe, it definitely is. I mean, the considerations are much more immediate for them. And so, when we're talking about risk management, it's like you do have to stay in business so that they can still sell coffee, and hopefully you can grow to the size where you can do more good for them and sell more coffee from them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in your field of like African coffees especially, that volume is a big hurdle to get over.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think I've talked to roasters too who struggle with it as well, because the relationship where you have a relationship with the farmer, that does, I mean, it pigeonholes you into, buying this specific coffee. And as soon as you limit your flexibility, you're limiting your supply, like the variety of supply that you could choose from.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times roasters of any side need a little bit more flexibility and adaptability, because if you lock yourself into this one specific farmer, that can work for like a single origin product, for example. But like if you're also roasting and brewing espresso and it doesn't quite hit the flavor profile, and you disappoint all of your clients because you were committed to this one farmer, you're not really doing yourself any favors. And then to your point, like if you go out of business because you're making commitments that are not good for your business, that will be a problem for the farmer in the end, because you wouldn't be buying it anyway. So I think that relationship coffee and direct trade is a wonderful model, but it's limited in scope is how I would put it.
Right, for now. I mean, maybe we innovate some way to eventually do more
technology
at scale.
Could change it. And then to answer your question more directly, like going back to, as you increase volume, do you decrease your interest in relationships? I don't think you decrease your interest in it, but like the feasibility becomes overwhelming. So like when you think about, we source from upwards of 25 million smallholder farmers, like I think technology could change it and make it feasible that they would all be known, but it's really difficult to know them all because it's if you think about, could the whole world's coffee be traded in a, face-to-face transactional sort of way, like farmer to roaster transactional sort of way? Maybe technology could make that happen. Like we're working on projects where we ID farmers and, we have more digital traceability to payments to, give income sort of assurances that are actually backed by verified data. I think those projects are really interesting, and that could, sort of start to like scratch at that idea of, could it all be transparent? But the reality right now is that not as much coffee is as could be or should be.
Yeah.
But not all. I also don't believe all coffee can be.
Right. And that does sound like, oh man, well, that's disappointing. Like we want to believe that it's not the case, but a lot of what we've got now as an industry is what it is. Not to sound glib, but the industry is the way it is now, and you can't change it overnight. I guess the hope would be that some of the values that you operate your business by will be picked up, just like larger corporate entities have picked up on what quote unquote third wave coffee was about, and they've made that like a corporate goal of theirs to be more like that. Either trickle up or trickle down, I don't know what direction, but they did.
It got popular. So.
It did, yeah, and so hopefully that can happen here. I mean, something else you talked about is also packaging, which is the other aspect of running a roastery. It's like you're operating on quality, but you're also operating on aesthetics, and a lot of it is branding. Like most people, I mean, I'm not a wine snob. I'll buy based on a label, and that happens in roasting all the time too. With the supply chain the way it is, what do people need to focus on in order to get through this period with their business intact and not really ruining the branding they worked so hard on?
I think you can find interesting supply chains if you work with the right partners as well. So, and actually, I was just talking with a good friend about this as well. Let me try and stay focused here. So there are supply chains that we work with, for example, that are traceable to farmers, but it might be like traceable to a network of 25,000 farmers. And so you buy a bag of this coffee and you know where it came from, and we have data about, what we paid to these farmers because we're purchasing cherry and, washing it at washing stations and running it through the dry mill. So like lots of traceability. But we couldn't tell you, like you buy this bag of coffee and we couldn't tell you it came from these 10 people, for example. Right. Because these are small farmers who are, collecting their coffee together, and, we know that it's traceable to this network and we have the data. And so I think trading coffee that is good for farmers in that way, but is actually a little bit more efficient, to produce, I think that could be a way to hang on to your values and like your authentic values if you're a roasting company that wants that traceability to farmers, but like without like breaking the pocketbook, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
Because supply chains like that can be more efficient.
Okay.
And they can also be good for the farmer. So finding those coffees that are sort of like the unicorn coffees where they are a good price point, you can blend with them, you can sell them into wholesale accounts, for example, and make the pricing work, but you know the supply chain from end to end.
Blends are hard in terms of packaging and things right now. Like the way that we produce our coffees so that people read the bags and they understand the information on it, it's hard to give 3 whole stories about coffee on the bag and, scratch that itch of this is a relationship coffee, but it's in a blend. It feels like that's maybe the other thing that's happening now is that the blends are reviving. And there's so many roasters that were single origin only, but now they're embracing blends. So when I hear you say that, I'm thinking, well, we need to innovate a way to get more transparency in blends because they've historically been this black box. Nobody talks about what's in the blend because we're ashamed. We feel like we've done something to our values, and it's in this deep, dark hole inside this bag, Well, I mean, how do we go about making a better blend, not just with, quality in mind, but with our ethics in mind as well?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's so important to note that I think as specialty coffee suppliers and roasters, we love the single origin, but most roasters I talk to, their most popular coffees are their blends. And so I think that is high time we paid more attention and gave a little love to the blending. It's also, I'm a big wine fan, as a lot of us are. And, you look at like the great winemakers in France and in Europe, and a lot of those are blending, they're blended for specific reasons. I think what happens sometimes is, we take coffee that we have too much of, or we take coffee that's maybe a little bit past its prime and we use that to blend, or, like blends kind of turn into just the sort of mixed bag, or they don't get enough attention. But I think making blends a little bit more, and this goes back to rotating origins, or not being afraid to rotate origins. So if you can rotate in origins that have different seasonality, you can actually keep your blends fresher and higher quality. Yeah. So like Uganda natural in place of an Ethiopian natural, for example, could be like a good, like they have a different harvest time. And so you can, create a blend that has a fresher, nicer product and keep your quality up. And this whole idea of intentional blends, that's coming like from the barista competitor scene. I was just talking to Sam Spillman, and she was telling me about some of these like very intentional blends where you layer the espresso inside the espresso puck. I feel like stuff like that can maybe help pave the way for specialty roasters to embrace the blend rather than just, kind of do it because they have to. Yeah,
it used to be the thing.
Yeah.
That was it. That was all you had was blends.
There was blends, and that was it. Yeah.
And interestingly, the way that we listen to our customers in specialties in the past, maybe this isn't who we are now. Maybe we're better now. We're ashamed to say that our dark roast Sumatra is the best seller on our shelves because we say, well, I'm not preaching the gospel of this other light roasted coffee hard enough. Like, what are we doing wrong with our messaging that everyone keeps buying this blend? But so it's almost like a mirror of how we don't listen to what's needed from farmers. Like, we don't listen to our customers. How are we going to be practiced in listening to farmers?
Yeah. I think listen to your customers and listen to your farmers, and I don't think we have to be ashamed to sell dark roasted Sumatra or just dark roasted Indonesia, because there's a lot more islands than just the one. Had to throw that in there. But no, I don't think we should be afraid of blends. I don't think we should be afraid to serve our customers. And I think we can maintain a sense of pride about the best and greatest single origin coffees and do that at a scale that's appropriate, which is a small scale. Like, those are truly special. They should be niche. They should be lower volume. They should be something that is really well processed and not, we shouldn't be so obsessed with it that we try to market things that aren't that as that,
Yeah.
Is that making sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and it is true too that for farmers and producers, like, they have a certain volume of coffee to sell, and not all of it is like a 90 plus. Not all of it is going to be, high 80s even. So, I think like being realistic about finding a home for every coffee,
Yeah.
and finding the best home for every
Yeah.
coffee. I think it's kind of my mission for
On-
farmers
on your
behalf
menu.
of farmers.
On your menu in your shop, like having a menu of roasted product that can have that variety attached to it, right? And that is mitigating risk in your roastery, because it makes you that flexibility as this like overarching theme of this conversation today. It makes sense for a lot of different areas too, not just in the roasted product. So if you could say like anything else as we wrap up here about how roasters should be approaching risk management, or at least how you want people to direct their actions this year especially, what would
Yeah.
you say?
Well, I think all roasters are struggling with price. And so I think, finding supply chains from solid suppliers that you're comfortable with, that do resonate with your values, is going to be really important. My biggest thing is, being flexible and adaptable in blending. I think despite our obsession with single origin coffees, I think blends are the vast majority of the market. And you can do things like, substitute a Honduras for a Guatemala, or substitute a Java for an Sumatra, or you can do things like, substitute those Uganda for Ethiopia, and take some of these emerging origins that are really interesting to work in,
Right.
and, be flexible and adapt. And it actually can make your quality better while you're also, managing your price risk, because it is a high market environment, and a lot of these small roasters out there are coming off like big hits to their revenue because of the pandemic, and then coming into a really high market like price environment. It can be very difficult. And so not being afraid to source coffee in a smart way, I think is my biggest advice.
That's awesome.
Be smart. Stay in business. We
Yes.
love you too much, and we love coffee too much for all the local independent roasters to price themselves out.
Well said. I love it. Kat, Nolte, Ferguson, Sucafina Coffee, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.